tell us your whole story.
Thanks, Deb. Hello, everybody. My name is Beth Hartley. I'm an alcoholic. Because of God's grace, AA sponsorship, I've been sober since June 26, 1988. And that is a miracle. 10 days was a long time for somebody like me to not drink. And I've always said if you were hanging out with me, it was even longer for you. Because I'd be a little edgy by the 5th or 6th day. And usually by the 7th or 8th day, you'd be saying, oh, I bet you could have a beer. It's okay, really. We might have been overcorrecting here, you know. I got sober in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they called them leads there as well. And we moved to North Carolina in 2002. And down there, if you lead a meeting, you are chairing the meeting and opening with a topic that you discuss for, a few minutes and then open the meeting. So it's not even that Ohio's the only place you hear lead. It means different stuff, different places. So when somebody calls me to see if I can lead a meeting, I always have to say, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? But it's good to be here. I think Deb and I met in 2004, 2005 down in Key West. So we've known each other for many, many years, and through triumph and tragedy and heartache and heartwarming, and because we get to live life here, and we get to live all of life, ups and downs and in betweens. My screen says Destin almost, because I've been from Cary, North Carolina since December of 2002, but I am retiring on June 30th and moving to Destin for good. I'm very happy about that. Chuck has wintered down here the last couple of years. We had a little kind of rental place that he and the dog would come down and escape the winter weather in North Carolina and escape me during tax season, because I'm a tax accountant, and it gets a little tense around the house by March. So it's kind of worked well, really. I just had to be nice to the cat, and then when we decided to retire to Destin this year, he and the dog came down, and we had bought our forever place. And so he and the dog came down and stayed, and I flew down April 16th with the cat, and the cat stayed. So like everybody's here but me. But 38 days from now, that will all be different. So I got to tell you, if you are newer, and you are not excited to be here, it's okay. I was not excited to be here. We don't really care if you're excited to be here or not. It just, what matters is that you're here. As with a lot of stuff in Alcoholics Anonymous, I have found that if I take the action, God changes my heart while I'm not looking, and everything catches up. But I actually grew up in Ohio, not too far, maybe 3-4 hours from where Deb grew up. I was in Oxford, Ohio, which is southwestern Ohio near Cincinnati. Miami University was there. It's a small college town. Sandy Beach has always said the longer you're sober, the better your childhood gets. And that's my experience. Because really growing up in Ohio as it was happening, it was my first resentment. I was born in Northern California where the redwood trees were, and moved against my will when I was 2.5, I think. Apparently my dad was drinking and Mom wanted to be closer to her family. So there's strike one at Mom, who I was pretty sure was trying to ruin my life through most of my life. She had these crazy ideas that you should be accountable for your actions, and I don't know, do what you said you'd do when you said you'd do it, and all these things that apparently everybody had been trying to teach me my whole life that I didn't learn until I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. And then it was like, oh my God, I learned the coolest thing. And, our parents are just like, oh my God, so glad you heard that, honey. But Oxford was a great place to grow up. I just didn't think so while I was growing up there. What I know now is I was already restless, irritable, and discontent as a kid. The first day of first grade, there was a gigantic U.S. map on the wall. And I'm looking at California where I'm supposed to be, and all the oceans and the Gulf of Mexico and Texas and Florida, and there's palm trees and and then there's Ohio. And I'm in first grade looking at a map, thinking that you could tell looking at a map that nothing's happening in Ohio. And, where does that come from when you're 6? You know what I mean? And I know now, like I said, I was already restless, irritable, and discontent, but you can't articulate that when you're 6. If you had said what's wrong with you, I couldn't have told you I was suffering from a spiritual malady that only a spiritual experience would conquer. I just thought I hated Ohio. And it went back farther than I was an only child. My favorite promise to this day in the big book is the one that says we can be alone at perfect peace and ease. Because I couldn't. I never could. I had a chorus of voices in my head from the very beginning that, would all convene and vote and tell me that nobody liked me, and everybody was talking about me and everybody's laughing at me, and I just, if we had a big family next door, I would just kind of stay at their house, because if I was in a quiet room, I was in an unfriendly place. My first escape was reading books. I learned to read before I got to school, and I could just dive into a book and not hear anything else that went on. And when I got to school was easy, probably because I'd been reading already. So I got good grades because school was easy. If school had been hard, I wouldn't have had good grades, because if it requires a lot of work, I'm not super interested in that. If it comes easy, great. But if I have to try hard, and part of that I know now too is that if I tried hard and failed, you would see me fail, and that's not acceptable. But my husband, Chuck, who you'll hear next week, got a master's degree in sobriety and social work. And he told me one day that I had a type AL personality. And I was like, I've heard of type A, but what is type AL? And he said, well, I have no doubt that you're type A, but you're lazy enough that you're not annoying. And it's true, but I would stay with the other families, and my dad got sober when I was 7 years old. It was 1966. I'm 61 now, so you don't have to do that math. But I was the kid, I was attending AA meetings in the 60s. I was the kid over in the corner with the coloring book at the Hamilton, Ohio Friday night speaker meeting, because my parents couldn't afford a sitter every week. And I knew that AA was full of old men who drank coffee and ate donuts and smoked, because I'd seen it. My God, my dad was 37, 38 years old by that time. And, they were his age, and even probably somewhere 40, my God, And so I met AA. So I grew up in a sober household. My mom is not alcoholic, never. I just don't think she tried hard enough. I mean, she'd drink 2 drinks and get sleepy. And I used to tease her. It's like, you can push through that. And, but she just was never willing. And so I knew about AA. I knew AA had a lot to do with not drinking. So of course that didn't interest me much when I drank. I remember, my dad told me all of the horrors and tragedy and loss through his drink. And if he told me he had fun, I don't ever remember hearing it. I just remember hearing all of the downside, and you know how we are. I mean, I start drinking and I'm just thinking I feel bad for him that he had such a hard time, but drink a little more like me, Dad, you could hang in there longer, but I didn't walk through the doors of AA and say, oh, thank God I'm home, this is where I want to be, and get sober and live happily ever after. I tried everything to stay out of Alcoholics Anonymous, because for one thing, like I said, I knew it had a lot to do with not drinking, and that I didn't want to not drink. I just wanted to drink without consequence, which got harder and harder to do. But I kind of did, I always try to make clear I did not relapse. I did not come into AA and relapse. I didn't come into AA and stay sober and drink. There was nothing to relapse from. I never came in and recovered. I went through treatment to stay out of jail. I went through treatment to get the heat off. I would come out of, now I'm a test taker, and if you're a test taker, you know who you are. And I got to tell you, you can ace treatment if you're a test taker. I can come out most likely to stay sober forever, every time. And I would get out and circle 90 days on my calendar and never see it. But, I get out and I know I have to do this and I know what I got to do. And I would for maybe a week, but I never really made a run at getting sober until 1988. So from 1983 to 1988, I think of it as drive-by AA. You know what I mean? I just would, circle through, and I would hear them talking about being self-centered, and I just never really thought that applied to me. Now, I found out later I didn't really know what it meant. I thought self-centered meant vain or selfish. And of course, I didn't think those applied to me either. I looked up selfish in the dictionary at about 10 years sober. And it says, because I just thought of selfish as like, I kept the biggest cookie for me, The dictionary has other thoughts. The dictionary says being totally consumed with one's own affairs, often to the exclusion of all others. And I went, okay, fair enough. I could see that, but I didn't know self-centered was how I had lived my entire life, until I came and stayed. And so I guess, one of the messages there is you do not have to understand all of this to stay. I don't have to be able to wire my house to walk in the door and turn the lights on. I don't have to understand how every wire and every junction and all of that works. I just know, like, flip the switch. And I'm glad I didn't have to understand, because so much of my understanding in sobriety has been hindsight. It's just, oh, that's what that was. Oh, that's what that did. That's what that meant. And so self-centered, I didn't know that self-centered was that you won't see me try anything new in public because I might fail at it and you might laugh. I didn't know self-centered was that I usually had one good friend at a time, and don't talk to my friend because she'll like you better, and then I'll have to get another friend, and you guys will probably talk about me. And I didn't know self-centered meant if I can't win, I don't want to play. Not because I have to win. Well, winning's good, but it's not really that I had to win. It's that you can't see me lose. I didn't know self-centered meant that if I walked into a room and two people in the back leaned their heads together and laughed, I knew they were talking about me. I didn't know that self-centered meant I was always keenly aware of everything going on around me. It's like I was a spectator in my own life. There was like the committee in my head had a little camera, and they were always scanning the crowd to see how we're doing and how, and how's it look. And when I got sober, in the big book, it says that one of the things we find out in inventory is the world and its people dominated us. And I didn't get that, because I see the word dominate, and I just thought physical domination. And for whatever reason, that wasn't part of my story. I was not in physically abusive relationships. I hung out with a lot of people that fought, but I've never thrown a punch in anger. Now, most of that is an acute fear that you would hit me back if I hit you and it would hurt. And then I would look bad, but still, and it's too, I've said for years, it's like when fights break out, drinks get spilled, it's just a hassle. So, I didn't understand that what dominated me is what you thought of me. And that was really surprising news, since I spent my whole life telling me and you and anyone who would listen that I don't care what you think of me. I could have passed a polygraph. I don't care what you think of me. I don't care what you think of me. And apparently the whole time I didn't care what you thought of me, I desperately cared what you thought of me. And what I have found out is that I always felt like if I told you my name's Beth, that you're just waiting for the rest. You're thinking like, so, and so that's why I was always super busy, Jim and Sally's daughter, I'm Beth the night auditor, I'm Beth the cheerleader, Beth doing this, doing that. I was just dancing as fast as I could, because if I sat still and it got quiet, I was in an unfriendly place, and so since I had to be something, be somewhere, who do I have to be with? Who do I have to not be seen with? What do I have to wear? Where do I have to work? What color should my motorcycle be? What, on any of that, all of this stuff. And I know now what I was doing was trying to arrange your perception of me so I could be comfortable. Because the big book, in the example where it's showing, 3/4 of the inventory, in that third column, it says self-esteem, 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 self-esteem. And by the late 80s, some, treatment and therapy lingo was creeping in. And so, even when I hear self-esteem, my immediate thought is, well, that's how I feel about myself. But, if you're an alcoholic of my variety, how I feel about myself has nothing to do with my self-esteem. How you feel about me has nothing to do with my self-esteem. However, what I think that you think about me has everything to do with my self-esteem. And, I can say that in an AA meeting and see laughing and heads nodding all over the room. And I got to tell you, if I said that at work, I'm a CPA and I work with a bunch of accountants. I'm still not sure how that happened. They're not really my people, but it's every now and then I say what I really think at work and it just gets super quiet. They just try to ponder and figure out exactly what I'm talking about. When there were big tax law changes years ago and there was going to be 1 year with no estate tax, zero. Like you could be a bazillionaire. If you died in 2010, no estate tax, right? So I'm in some kind of continuing ed in 2008, and they're all at lunch talking about it, of course, because it's not bad enough. We got to sit in 8 hours. We got to talk at it at lunch too. But they're all talking about it in 2010 and no estate tax. And I just kind of offhandedly said, yeah, that's the year that I was going to push my mom down the stairs. And I went back to my sandwich and, and all of a sudden I realized I had gotten very quiet. And I look up and like everybody, it's a round table with 9 other people and they're all just kind of like, with their sandwich, just not like, did she mean that? Wouldn't you? Anyway, but if I said that, at work, that how I felt about myself depended on what I thought you thought of me, they would not get that. But, we get that. If you're new and you followed any of that, you are in the right place. All those years that we thought nobody could possibly think the crazy crap that we did, guess what? You are now. One of the favorite things I heard out of a newcomer, she got up to speak and she said, I got to Alcoholics Anonymous and I found out I was unique like everybody else. And I just love that. So here I am not caring what you think of me while I'm trying to arrange your perception of me so I can be okay. And I'm dancing as fast as I can. And that's, by the time I'm in junior high and high school, that's yearbook staff, pep club, honor society, band, cheerleading, student council, you name it. I am doing it. I'm doing it. Because if I stop, it's quiet and I'm in an unfriendly place. And when I drank at 15 years old, enough that I felt the effects of alcohol. And I didn't know I'd been holding my breath for 15 years until I exhaled. I felt the effects of alcohol and I could breathe. And I didn't know I hadn't been able to breathe until I was breathing again. And within a year, most of that stuff was gone. Some of it I gave away, some of it I threw away, some of it got taken away. But my life pretty quickly focused around drinking. I wasn't a daily drinker because I was in Ohio and it was a 21 state. They had this horrible affront to beer drinkers everywhere called 3-2 beer, which was a lower alcohol percentage that you were allowed to drink if you were 18. Horrible stuff. And Oxford was a 3-2 town because 2/3 of the population was under age 21. The students outnumbered us 2-1. But I would have been a daily drinker if I had had daily access. There's no doubt in my mind. I never had a line in the sand about morning drinking because, my God, if you could drink in the morning, why wouldn't you? My day just went better if I could start with a drink. I had a huge capacity for alcohol from the beginning so I could drink with the big boys. So I did, when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, on one of the drive-bys, they said, hang out with women. And I was just horrified by that because I thought, I don't even drink with women and you want me to hang out with them sober? Talk about hearing the gates of hell just slam shut. And I just, because in high school when the girls are drinking, it's just embarrassing. They're falling down, they're throwing up, they're giggling, everybody likes the same boy, and then later on there's husbands and that gets kind of, those lines get a little blurry because I don't know about you, but I did most of my dating at last call. And, are you married just doesn't seem important at 2:30 in the morning. It just doesn't come up. And so, like hanging out with women was never high on my list. But what I have found, because the big book says that drinking is a symptom. And of course, when I was new, I thought, whatever, because I really knew that drinking was causing all the problems. But the longer I'm sober, the more I see that drinking was a symptom. My thinking was so far off long before I drank. That the whole self-centered thing. I was telling somebody today, I did not take a pic. Like we went down to Gatlinburg for something, and I wouldn't take pictures if I was visiting somewhere because I didn't want to look like a tourist. Like somebody 10 years later is going to go, oh my God, there's that stupid girl that was taking pictures in Gatlinburg. I thought nobody had anything better to do than think about every stupid thing I've ever done, but I am not self-centered. Just ask me, and there's a story I've been telling for years about my daughter, because it just really opened my eyes to how different my thinking was. Sarah was 4 years old when I got sober. My son Robbie was 6. They had not been in my custody for 3 years when I got sober. So losing the kids didn't sober me up. And Sarah's the one that we would have told you was going to be in AA by the time she was a teenager. I mean, she had a gleam in her eye. I was a liar and a thief and a shoplifter long before I drank. My parents were merchants in uptown Oxford, so I had the run of High Street as a kid. And I was a pretty accomplished shoplifter by second grade. And Chuck and I used to tell people, you might be saving for college. We're saving for treatment, because we just knew it was coming. And so when Sarah was 11, a lot of her friends swam and she wanted to be on a swim team. So we took her to try out. And the coach said, well, I think you'll be all right. But she didn't have much experience in the water. So he said, well, I think you'll be all right. But I'd like you to practice down in age group, until your skills come up. And so this means, she's 11 years old and this is age group swimming. So this guy wants her to practice with 9-year-olds and she's 11. And I'm 7 years sober when this happened, dying 1,000 deaths because my 11-year-old has to practice with 9-year-olds. And, how am I going to look? She was okay with it, and so 2 weeks later is the first swim meet. And these are big USS sanctioned teams where there'll be 15, 20 teams and they just run heats and post the results. And her very first race ever, she was 70th out of 72. And it's on the wall, so anybody walking by can see. And that was Saturday. And Sunday morning, she was up and dressed and ready to go back to the pool. I got to tell you, I would have been trying to get my parents to relocate, And we said, well, Sarah, you didn't win. But you have a baseline time now. And in your next race, even if you don't win that race, if you beat your time, that's a successful race because you have a new personal best. And the whole time I was telling her that, I'm thinking, right. My parents told me that when I swam, it's just the stuff you're supposed to tell your kids. I didn't buy into it when they told me. She beat her time and she was happy. Now, the rest of that story is 2 years later, she's a state AA swimmer. She swam all over the Midwest for until she was about halfway through high school. And what I realized was that when she started that at 11 years old, she had never had a drink. And when I was 11, I had never had a drink. But if that had been me and the coach said practice down in age group, that would have been the beginning and end of my swimming career on day one. I could not have gotten in the water with the 9-year-olds because how would it look? And so Chuck and I we're watching Sarah with interest, because we're not sure what to do with this behavior. It's like we would recognize normal, but we kind of waited to see what happened. And she took that turn with the swimming because she somehow set a goal, work for the goal, achieve the goal. She just got that and she did it. Now, I understand the concept, but my outlook has pretty much just been, just give me the goal. Why would I work for it if I could get you to give it to me? I'm fine with setting up a lawn chair at the start line and letting you bring me the trophy. But she just got it. And she just kind of, so she took this weird turn on us and she just kept going that way. She got a summer job and she saved money. She graduated, through 12th grade in 12 years, same school, same friends. She decided during her freshman year that when she graduated, she wanted to join the military. And 3 years later, when she graduated on time, she joined the military. She served active duty 10 years, and another 3 in the reserves. She met a man in the Army, and they got married, and they had a daughter 18 months later. I mean, who does that? We did when she was 14. We said, there's supposed to be one mature person in the house. We think it might be you, because we just didn't know what to do with her. But she just, and so when I look at that, and Sarah at 11 and me at 11, it's really obvious that what I used to think is we just react very differently to life. And, what I think now is Sarah doesn't react to life. Sarah responds to life. And there's a difference, There is a difference between reacting and responding. And I just was I used to have this toy when I was a kid. It was like Dino the dinosaur from the Flintstones. And it, you'd turn him on, and he'd kind of roll this way till he hit something. And then he'd go this way till he hit something. And then he'd go this way till and that's kind of how I roll. I'll just go till I crash into something. Then I'll change directions. But she just, she grasped that concept of, do what you said you do and work for a goal and all that stuff that I know people tried to teach me. I lived by 2 rules that I'm pretty sure my parents never taught me. One of them was it's not all right not to know, because it's just not. I was doing fake it till you make it long before I got here. And it's not, if you asked a question in school, I was embarrassed for you. Because now the whole class knows that you don't know. I would not. And that's that same self-centered thing. If I ask, you'll know I don't know. So I am not asking a question. And the other one is it's never, ever, 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 ever should you admit ever that you have made a mistake. It's like, go down with that ship. I ended up married for 5 years, living that one out. It should have been a one-night stand. I said for a lot of years there shouldn't have been a second date, but truth is there wasn't a second date. He had a keg party and I just stayed, because I had been in South Florida for about 8 months, and it was a little town, Bonita Springs, and there's like 3 bars. And by the end of 8 months, I'm out of places to work already, and I'm out of people to date since I dated last call, and there's only 3 bars. And it was looking like I might have to go back to Ohio, which I did not want to do. And this guy moved to town from California. We've joked for years they really need a sign at the state line of Florida and probably California and Arizona that says this state doesn't work either. And then if you saw somebody pull up and read it and just turn around and leave, you have found the alcoholic, So anyway, there's a 5-year marriage that never should have happened. And inventory showed me later, I could have written books on that, books of inventory on all that he did. But the truth is there's in the inventory, before it shows you the example, there's that paragraph that says selfishness and self-centered is the root of our problem. And then toward the end of the paragraph, it says, sometimes people hurt us seemingly without provocation, but invariably, which is, always, we find that at some time in the past, we made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. And that's been a key paragraph in a lot of my inventory, because there will be things, maybe I resent somebody for this. And I had a big one on my first inventory, and my sponsor just kind of said, what were you doing there? And I was like, what do you mean, what was I doing there? And I told her what I was doing there, and she just kind of went, well, there you go. And I'm thinking, no, that can't be it, because that cost me a lot of money, and it should only cost this much, but it was this much. And I remember, because I was 3 or 4 weeks sober when I did my first 4th and 5th step. Thank God I fell in with people who read the book and did what it said, because I couldn't have gone 2 months or 6 months or a year or 5 years without writing that inventory. That first inventory was for everything that kept me up at night, everything that I was never going to tell anyone, and I really believe if I'd remembered it all at once, it would have killed me. I trust God to shove it up to the top when it's time. I get nervous when I see the 600 question inventory helpers, because they dredge up a whole lot of stuff that I wouldn't have been prepared to look at. But anyway, that's just my brief off into Beth Hartley opinion land, but I'm back now. I did that first inventory early, and my sponsor had kind of said, what were you doing there? And I, intellectually, I sort of got it. And I remember going home that night and just saying to God, okay, God, I don't really get this, but she's sober longer than me. I'm going to take her word for it and trust that you'll explain it to me later. So, 2 years later, I'm sponsoring someone who had been in prison, and she was, she wasn't fat, but she was, big boned, we'll say. And so the guards harassed her a bit. She thought that was unfair because she had towed the line and followed all the rules, and she didn't deserve to be treated that way. And I heard myself ask her, well, what were you doing there? And to which she said, 2 years. And I went, no, did you just wake up and say, hey, I think I'll go to Marysville today? Well, no, she had robbed a store. And robbing that store was her decision based on self that later placed her in a position to be harassed by the guards. And when I saw that one with her, mine went from the head to the heart. All of a sudden, it was very clear. So a lot of times I'll tell people, when you're writing that inventory and that fourth column is just empty, I can't figure out what I could have done to deserve this. Maybe it's because it didn't happen right at the point of, being hurt by this other person. I might need to say, how did I get here? And invariably, like the book says, always I will find that sometime in the past I made a decision based on self, which put me there to get hurt later. And that was really eye-opening for me, to see all of that stuff. But I just, so I'm rolling, I'm self-centered, I'm drinking. Like I said, I love to drink. My day just went better with a drink. I'm a child of the 70s. We had many other things, better living through chemistry was always our motto. And, there were a lot of things easier to hide in a school locker than a fifth of whiskey, And, but I didn't struggle with where I belonged when I got here. I started out drinking. I did a ton of drugs all the way up down the other side. But the deal is, as my alcoholism progressed, drugs began to interfere with my drinking. And so they had to go, because anything that interfered with my drinking had to go. And by the time I was done, that was my integrity, my employability, my children, the first marriage that never should have happened anyway, but still, all of this stuff. And Sharon in Los Angeles talks about that she pushed her integrity across the bar for a drink, that she sold it all for a drink. And that made sense for a long time. But I really, if I sit and think about it, I don't think I even sold it for a drink. I pawned it because I always thought I would go get it back. I just thought I was parking it over here and I'll come back and get it later. And I just never got it back. I drank from age 15 to age 29. And that time I told you I lost custody of my children. In 1985, I had, gotten out of Ohio, moved to South Florida. I worked it was in the Keys for a while. That probably sped my trip to AA by a bit. I worked in this fabulous place that had 7 bars and 3 restaurants, and I had keys to all the bars, and they paid me. I did the best job ever, And I got fired from that job because I'd gone in at 5 for happy hour, and I was still there at 11 when I had to clock in. And I kind of intuitively knew I wasn't going to find another job quite like that anywhere else. So that's the first time I ever went to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and said that I was an alcoholic. Because, I've heard people say they sat in the bar and said, I'm alcoholic, who cares? Well, with a sober parent, that's not an option. I always knew intuitively that if I put that A word in the same sentence with my name, that a big book was going to drop out of the sky. So you would never hear me wondering if I was alcoholic. But I got fired from this job and kind of intuitively knew nobody else was going to pay me to drink all night. And so I go to a Tuesday night Key Largo group of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was 1983. I'm 24 years old. They're very nice. They're old. These people were probably 40 or 50. It was a little circle discussion groups and nowhere to hide, and everybody's relating to everybody. And I'm just thinking, and if I didn't think I had gone to hell yet, the meeting's over and they all run over and invite me to Perkins. And I'm just, if you don't have Perkins, it's like Denny's, and I just remember thinking, it's like, great, it's like, I have a Harley Davidson out there. I'm 24 years old. It's 9:30 on a Tuesday night, and I've been invited to Perkins. Like, I just, it's like, do I kill myself now, or do I get pancakes and then kill myself? I just, oh. But, as luck would have it, I made an appointment with my ex-boss, told him I knew I had a problem. I was going to AA. And, I was always one of those, you remember that cartoon with the guy that kind of toddles down the sidewalk and the safes and pianos are just crashing behind him? He's oblivious, and that's just how I rolled. I mean, I might get clipped every now and then by the edge of a piano, but I never got crushed like I should have. The only time I ever got suspended from school for drinking, it snowed the next day and there was no school. So I have my record's clear, because that's just how I roll. And so I went to my boss and told him I knew I had a problem and I was going to AA. And as luck would have it, they put the weekend girl up to full time. She didn't want to work full time and everybody hated her. So one AA meeting and I get my job back because AA works, it really does. So I go back to the Friday meeting and I tell them I got my job back, and I was done with AA and the keys. But I did call Dad and tell him that I'd been to a meeting and said I was an alcoholic. And within a week, I get a box from Dad, and it's got a big book and a 12 and 12, each day a new beginning, 24 hours a day, one day at a time, a cassette tape of his talk, some pamphlets. I used to joke I didn't know how long he'd been tossing stuff in the box, but one meeting and it is in the mail, So within a year, the practice husband finally says, get out, which is what I've been waiting for because, I can't leave or it would be my fault. But he only had to say get out once. And I'm on the phone with Mom, send me some money. He threw me out, and she would not send me money, but she sent me plane tickets to Ohio because now I had a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old baby. And so I'm back in Ohio in 1984, and I'm thinking, okay, fine, maybe I should do AA, but I really thought if I just quit drinking with bikers, life would calm down. And she lived in one of those neighborhoods that stepped out of the pages of an L.L. Bean catalog, couldn't be more unbiker where she lived, and of course that didn't work either. And I, I went to AA, I had my AA starter kit that my dad has sent me, And, in 1984 in Cincinnati, Young People's was on fire. I'm 25 years old, and a Monday night Young People's group in Cincinnati had 200 people. They met in Purcell High School gym. And the Friday night live group was Young People, 150 people in St. Cecilia's school cafeteria. ICYPA, the International Convention of Young People, which moves around the country from city to city, had been in Ohio in 1983, in Cincinnati. So they were on fire, But when I walk into a big group, it splits into 2 groups, all of you and me. And I don't know what to say after my name's Beth at an AA meeting any more than I know what to say anywhere else. And so I just went to the bar because I know what to do at the bar. And that set me off on, within a year, my kids were removed from my custody. My dad died while I was in treatment, so I got the insurance money because I'm an only child of divorced parents. And the kids stayed at my mom's, and I was glad they were gone. That's one of the things I realized in treatment that one of those things you don't tell people if you don't want to look bad. The big book talks about the alcoholic having a double life, the one that we know is true and the one we want people to see. And of course, I can't tell anybody I'm glad my kids are gone, but I knew they were getting better care at my mom's. That was clear. They got to daycare and clean clothes on time. They got dinner at dinner time. And it's not I never did any of that, but I couldn't do it all on a consistent basis. And then I had the insurance money, so I got to drink the way I wanted to drink for the next 2.5 years with a periodic trip through treatment, to keep the heat off. And then in June of 1988, I ran off to Florida one more time, because I knew they were all down there going, God, I wish Beth would come back. I'd been gone 4 years. And of course, I got down there. There's no homecoming parade. And I ran out of, I didn't even have it. Took my mom's credit card, and she had money until the credit card maxed. And I've always been grateful that they had low limits back then, or I'd be in prison for grand larceny. But I ran out of money on June 26, 1988. I'm in the Fort Myers, Florida airport. I don't have $1. I can't even get one beer. If I can get one, I can get 2, but I couldn't bear the thought of being asked to leave the bar because it would have been obvious I needed a drink, that somebody else needed to buy. and there weren't cell phones and ATMs and all that back then. And so a lot of senior citizens, and I thought maybe I can just snag a purse, from a little old lady and get some cash. But I was so hungover, I knew I'd pick on the little old lady that did aerobics twice a week. She'd run me down and take her purse back, and I would look so bad. So I called Mom, and she said, call me back, and hung up, and apparently consulted her Al-Anon friends. And when I called her back, she said, I'm flying you home. Well, I'm not flying you home. I'm flying the kid's mother home because we're afraid we'll never see you again. And I got on the plane. That was June 26, 1988. I hadn't had a drink all day. She picked me up at midnight at the airport, drove me straight to the local detox and said, go in or don't, but you can't come home with me. I've done everything I can do for you. You have to do this. And she left. And I went in, and the next morning I'm trying to come up with a plan B, because God knows we need a plan B. And everything I could come up with, I had already tried. My car's impounded, charges pending, whatever. None of that's new. But what was new is I didn't have an idea about what to do about any of it. And I realized I'm 29 and a half years old, and I'm in detox, and I had no plans to be 30. I thought I'd be dead. And a voice came out of nowhere and said, people like you don't die, Beth. You're going to live 20, 30, 40, 50 more years, whether you're drinking or not. And that terrified me. And I just had a passing thought that whatever those people in AA are doing seems to be working because they're staying sober and you're not. Maybe you should just go do what they do. And I had no idea that would be the surrender that stuck. And I stayed in detox 5 days. I got out of detox, and I went to 405 Oak Street in Cincinnati, and I went to a meeting. I almost didn't because I've been going all week in detox. I could take a night off. But one voice in my head said, you skipped meetings before and you drank. Maybe you should go. So I went, and I got somebody's phone number who told my biggest secret to a room full of people, because it was her story too. And I went to call her the next day, and I didn't want to, and it took half an hour. And one voice in my head said, you didn't call people before and you drank. Maybe you should just call. And of course, just my luck, she answered the phone. I told her, I'm just practicing. I don't have a clue what to say to you, but I know I have to call. And my first 30 days was a whole lot of ignore the first thought, do the second thought, and I've heard it said around meeting, we're not responsible for the first thought, but we're responsible for the second thought and the first action. And I just fell into the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous. I did a big book meeting every day at noon. I did a speaker meeting every night. I did it because I liked it. There was a lot of laughter in that big book meeting. And unbeknownst to me, people who go to big book meetings on purpose are the same ones who read it and do what it says. So I had stumbled into really active people. There's a huge pocket of enthusiasm in Cincinnati AA. And I liked the speaker meetings at night. Now, I didn't know until years later that what I had done by doing that was wandered into the two types of meeting most likely to be centered on a solution instead of the problem. There are, unfortunately, meetings, probably not where you live, but I have on occasion been to a meeting that has been an hour of the problem instead of an hour of the solution. And you can tell because you feel better, you feel worse when you leave than you did when you got there. But a big book meeting, you just can't go wrong because the answer is in the book. That's the foundation that I have stood on, in the speaker meetings. I met my husband in Alcoholics Anonymous. You guys will hear him next week. We decided to date with our clothes on, which was a novel concept for both of us, but it worked. We fell in like before we fell in love. In July, we'll celebrate 28 years of marriage. We're having a great time. We're on our kind of chapter 3 of our AA life. We were 14 years sober. He is also class of 88. And we are 14 years sober when we moved from Cincinnati to North Carolina. And we've been in North Carolina 17 years. We've been 18 if we made it till December. And now we're going to be in Destin, retired together, and so looking forward to it because we like hanging out together. We like doing AA together. I have always been in the middle. I have always had a sponsor, not Chuck. He's not my sponsor. I'm not his sponsor. We agreed at the beginning that we would do God first, AA second, then each other. And one of our first official kind of dates to the New Year's Eve dance, we were having dinner first. It was an AA thing. The phone rings, somebody needs a ride. The phone rings again, somebody else needs a ride. So we had dinner, and then he went east and picked somebody up, and I went west and picked somebody up, and we met at the dance. And then as midnight, speaker speaks, midnight kiss, Happy New Year. He takes somebody home on the East End. I take somebody home on the West Side. We met back for breakfast because that's dating in AA. You know, a lot of AA dating is coffee before the meeting or coffee after the meeting, and you're never really sure if you should kiss goodnight or say the Lord's Prayer when it's over. You know, but we figured it out, and so we have God first, AA second, and then each other. And I tell him, you know, if I'm not thinking about me, he is third in my life. You know, and if I am thinking about me, he's still in the top 5, which I think is pretty good. But you know, we just have a life beyond our wildest dreams, and that is not something all I wanted when I got here was to stop getting arrested. I wanted my driver's license back. And I wanted maybe someday, maybe to remarry, preferably to a guy that would work this time, which also didn't come up at last call a whole lot, you know? And we have so much more than that. You know, we have history with people. We've known Deb for 15 years. You know, and the friends we make here, you may not see them for a year or two, and then it's like you just saw each other last week. You know, we have friends all over the country, all over the world. With the Zoom thing going on, you know, we're getting to see a lot of people that we wouldn't have seen unless we were out crossing paths. You know, we've gotten to reconnect with a lot of people, and they've been worried about people trying to get sober with Zoom. But it's like when it's all you know, that's what works. You know, is the newcomers are not having trouble with Zoom. You know, because that's where AA is. That's where they are. If you're new, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. I am now going to be one of those people that I swore I'd never be and say, I love Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I am so grateful for everything I've been given here. And it is just as easy to be grateful as it is to not. You know, one of the things I heard when I was new is you can't be grateful and pissed off at the same time. And you can't be grateful and depressed at the same time. So I've always got a choice. You know, I can be pissed off because my car ran out of gas, or I can be grateful that I've got a car. If it's up to me. So, Deb, thanks so much for asking me.